When it comes to understanding whether churches are nonprofits, I think this is one of the most misunderstood parts of nonprofits and 501c3 status. So let's break down what we're going to talk about today. First, I'm just going to give briefly an explanation of what nonprofits are and what tax exempt status is, so you have a good understanding when we start talking about churches. Then we're going to talk about how that applies to churches, whether or not churches are nonprofits. Then we're going to talk a little bit about, well, what is a church and how does it qualify to be a nonprofit? And then I'm going to put it all together and talk about churches, nonprofits, and 501c3 status in particular, and break down a really big myth and misconception with 501c1ai. That was a doozy, but that is one really misunderstood section of the code, and we're going to talk about it near the end of the video. So I know you want me to answer right away, are churches nonprofits? In most circumstances, yes, but it becomes complicated because there are so many layers when it comes to nonprofits and tax exempt status. So you got to understand some basic things before you just hear an answer to a question, because it's not exactly cut and dried. So let's talk about what is a nonprofit. In its simplest term, a nonprofit is an entity organized for public benefit or to benefit its members. So typically it's an entity organized to benefit others, and it's not to benefit the people who created it or incorporated it, right? So inherently there are no owners of nonprofits. It's just organized and governed in a way to be able to fulfill its mission, whatever that mission is. And again, that mission could be for a public benefit, or it could be just to satisfy the people who are part of the organization as a member. So if you are an association, or if you're a credit union, your mission isn't necessarily focused on benefiting the public, but it is focused on benefiting your members. If you are a sorority, for example, and you're organized as a nonprofit, then you may be carrying out activities that benefit others, but you're really organized to benefit those who are members. If you want a more detailed breakdown of what a nonprofit is, then check out this video I'm linking above, because on my channel, I break down a lot of the misconceptions about nonprofits, and I did a video on what nonprofits are. What tends to confuse people is the next thing I'm going to talk about, which is 501c3 status. People assume that if you're a nonprofit, you automatically have 501c3 status, or that's the only tax exempt status that you have, and that's not true. So 501c3 status is when the IRS grants your organization an exemption from having to pay income tax federally. So generally, if you are operating as a business and you make money, you got to pay tax on that. But if you're tax exempt, then the IRS basically is saying to you, you don't have to pay it because you're organized for specific reasons. Now you have to meet their criteria for what that is, but once you fit that criteria, then you're off the hook for paying taxes. There are also different tax exempt statuses. So 501c3 refers to organizations that are organized for religious, educational, scientific, or charitable purposes. So I'm showing on the screen the documentation from the IRS that shows this, because I like to tell people, go to the source. Don't just rely on what you hear or what you see on the internet. Go to the actual source, and I'm actually going to link below where you can go to find more information. But there are different criteria for meeting 501c3 status. Also, you cannot be organized to benefit a private citizen, right? It cannot be organized to benefit an individual person. You cannot endorse political candidates. You cannot engage in political lobbying over a certain percentage in your organization. When your organization dissolves, then your assets have to go to another nonprofit organization. So there are certain rules you have to comply with when you want to be seen as a 501c3 organization. Now just know there are different types of 501cs, right? And 501c3 is not the only one, but typically churches qualify to be tax exempt under 501c3. Why? Because you meet the requirements if you're organized for religious purposes. That's one of the categories that's included in the tax code for 501c3 organizations. So for that purpose, that's what we're going to talk about today. I just wanted you to know that there are other type of tax exemptions with the federal government, and 501c3 is not the only one. So I wanted to lay that groundwork first so you understand what we're talking about when I say things like nonprofit or 501c3 status, and also to make sure you understand that just because you're organized as a nonprofit doesn't mean you are a 501c3 organization. But now let's bring churches into the mix. Well, what makes it a church, right? And then also, how does a church qualify as being a nonprofit? So let me just say this. The definition of a church is really murky, and the definition differs depending on what you're talking about and what it's related to. So in terms of a church being a nonprofit, it typically is a nonprofit. That's typically how churches are organized, because they typically are tax exempt. And in order to be tax exempt, you have to be organized that way. So it kind of goes hand in hand. But sometimes churches are not organized as a business entity, right? They're not officially incorporated at a state. So I can't even attempt to define what a church is because there's so many different definitions. But for the purpose of this video, we'll just say it is a body of people organized under a certain doctrine who come together to worship, to carry out the mission. And if we're talking about a church, it is the overall mission of Jesus Christ. If we're talking about the Christian church, we're talking about that. So that is like a really basic definition that we're going to go off of in this video, because it depends. You may be having meetings and maybe having worship, but haven't organized in any kind of way as a business structure. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're not a church in certain conversations, right? So it just is very, very murky. But this is when it comes to play with nonprofits and 501c3 status. For 501c3 status, if you want the benefits of being tax exempt, then you have to meet certain criteria according to the IRS. So again, let me be clear that you can be organized as a church, but if you're not interested in tax exempt status, you don't necessarily have to meet these requirements. But if that's your goal, then that's when the IRS definitions come into play. Now, the IRS doesn't have a firm definition. You'll see they'll do this a lot. They won't directly answer a question, but they'll signal that there are certain things you need to have in consideration that when they do their assessment, they're thinking about. So there are actually 14 criteria that the IRS used to determine whether or not an entity is operating as a church in order for that church to qualify as tax exempt. So on the screen here, you'll see the 14 different criteria, and the IRS says that they use a combination of these to determine whether or not an entity qualifies as a church. So if that body or that entity has a distinct legal existence or recognized creed and form of worship, or a definite and distinct ecclesiastical government, a formal code of doctrine and discipline, distinct religious history, membership not associated with any other church or denomination, organization of ordained ministers selected after completing prescribed courses of study, literature of its own, an established place of worship, regular congregations, regular religious services, Sunday schools for the religious instruction of the young, and schools for the preparation of its members. So it is a combination of those things that the IRS uses to determine whether or not a church actually qualifies for 501c3 status. So though that didn't exactly answer the question of is a church a nonprofit, I'll just say for this section of the video, typically yes. And then typically, because a church is nonprofit, typically a church has 501c3 status. But let's talk in this next section about 501c3 status and how churches are treated differently in that tax code. And again, we're going to break down one really big common misconception that's all over the internet. So here's one thing that may surprise you. Churches automatically have 501c3 status. If you are recognized as a church by the IRS, you do not have to apply for tax exempt status to get the benefits of being a 501c3 organization. That means that you don't have to fill out any paperwork. Typically, when I talk about becoming a nonprofit, I'll talk about, hey, you have to incorporate with the state, and then you have to fill out either 1023-EZ or the 1023 form. If you are recognized as a church by the IRS, then that's not a requirement for you. Churches may wish to apply for 501c3 status, but they don't have to. And in some instances, they may want to do it because they want to produce a determination letter. So sometimes you want to get comped food or you want to get something sponsored for your church. Say you want to go to your local pizza restaurant and you want them to donate some pizzas, and they'll say, well, we need your 501c3 letter. Well, because you're automatically exempt, you don't get a letter, but once you apply, you can apply so you can get that letter and use it for that purpose. Also, if people want to donate to you and then for some reason they may be audited and they need to trace back whether or not the organization that they donated to is 501c3 and they want that documentation, that's pretty rare. But if you need that documentation, then sometimes it's good to have that letter or have that security of knowing you can produce that letter when someone who has donated to the church needs it. But again, it's not required. But if you want that determination letter, which basically says you are a 501c3 organization, then you would have to apply. So churches actually do have kind of a special status, if I could say it like that. And the main two ways they have special status is, first of all, they don't have to apply if they don't want to for 501c3 status, but also they don't have to file 990 forms. So 990 forms are annual tax returns that nonprofits have to file. They have to file information about how much money they've made. They have to file information about where the money has come from and how they spent the money once they start making a certain amount. Right? So that is a requirement typically for nonprofit organizations, and churches do not have to file those 990 forms. Now, the churches may have other tax obligations like payroll taxes, which can get a little bit more complicated, and I'm not talking about today, but there may be other kinds of taxes that the church has to address that's separate from this. I'm talking about the income that the church brings in when people donate, or if the church has some kind of way to generate money, maybe through sales or something like that. They don't have to pay income tax on that, and they don't have to file a report that other nonprofits have to file annually to report on that money that they made. So a church is kind of one of those special entities that get special benefits. And I'll also say it's not just churches, it's also churches and affiliated organizations with churches. So if you're an integrated auxiliary of a church, so if you're an entity or a group within the church, then you also may receive these benefits. If you're affiliated with the church and your role is to raise money for that church, you may also qualify just as the church qualifies. If you're a church affiliate mission society and things like that, you may also enjoy the same benefits as a church, but you do need to go read the IRS documentation to see if you apply. Let me say something really quickly. There are some organizations that do mission type work, but they're not organized as a church, right? They don't have regular worship services. They don't come together. They don't have a doctrine that they aspire to as a church, but they still do church-like or mission type activities, but they're more so kind of like a standalone nonprofit, not a church. That's not a church, and so you still have to apply for tax exempt status if you want to obtain 501c3 status. So again, you may be affiliated with the church, but you're a nonprofit, then you more than likely will have to apply for 501c3 status if you want the benefits of that, and you still have to adhere to the same requirements as any other 501c3 organization. And let me just say this. Just because a church is automatically considered a 501c3 organization doesn't mean that they don't follow the rules of 501c3 organizations. So minus the 990 requirement, they still have to make sure that they're not organized to benefit certain individuals or private individuals. They still can't engage and endorse political campaigns. They have to severely limit their political lobbying, things like that. The same requirements of other 501c3 organizations still apply to them, again, minus the 990 requirement. So finally, I want to talk about section 508C1A. And it's a part of the tax code that talks about churches and clarifies that churches are not required to apply for tax exempt status. But what has happened over the years is that people have seen that and have assumed that that's separate from 501c3 status. See, this is the thing. 501c3 status is a category of organizations that meet a certain category of tax exemption. But under that, there have been some clarifications and rules and provisions and additions to help clarify that for people who have questions about different types of organizations. So over the years, there has been more added to the tax code to provide clarification on certain rulings or exemptions. So that section is not separate from 501c3, it's an added clarification. So if you do a search on the internet, or if you're doing your own searching, you may think, oh, I don't have to be organized as 501c3, so I don't have to adhere to those requirements. I can just be a 508c1a organization, as if they're separate. And I'm here to tell you they're not. And there are a lot of people who will be really gung-ho about it and say, no, if you read it, you'll see it's a different type of organization. If you really read for yourself and study it, you'll see that it's still under 501c3. It's just clarifying more about 501c3 organizations. And it's very simple. It's just saying these types of entities are exempt from filing for 501c3 status. And it's calling out churches, integrated auxiliaries, and it's calling out conventions or associations of churches. That's really all it is, but people have really taken it out of context and said, well, this is a separate type of organization and you don't have to adhere to 501c3 requirements if you are a 508c1 organization. And there's not a difference. It's just more clarification. So if you are organized as a church and you want the benefits of being a 501c3 organization, make sure you're still following those rules so you don't risk the IRS revoking that status and you risk the trust of your donors and your congregation in that process. So I hope this helped clarify some things about churches and nonprofits. My job is to help break down misconceptions about nonprofits and help people who want to start their nonprofits. So if you're interested in creating a nonprofit organization, comment checklist below, because I have a free startup checklist that can help you navigate that startup process. And it breaks down certain things that most people don't know about starting a nonprofit. Also, if you need help just with starting a nonprofit and learning how to raise money, you can visit me at bossonabudget.com, and I have a lot of information and resources there for you as well. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.